I remember the first time I noticed the subtle changes in my son. I spent every day of my life raising him with love, patience, and sacrifice, believing that no matter what, the bond between a mother and her child was unbreakable. But over the years, I began to see a shift. His laughter no longer carried the warmth it once did, and the little attentions I had always taken for granted were replaced with impatience, barely concealed eye rolls, and occasional sighs that spoke louder than words. I told myself it was just the stress of adulthood, of marriage, of responsibility. After all, life changes people, doesn't it? My late husband had always warned me that the world could be unkind, and sometimes even family could be swayed by ambition. I never truly understood how prescient his words were until that day when I realized my son's laughter no longer belonged to me. It belonged to someone else, someone who whispered into his ear, shaping the man I had once known. My daughter in law, with her polite smile in public and a sharp edge hidden behind closed doors, had a way of making me feel smaller without ever raising her voice. I would catch her looking at me with that same thinly veiled contempt when we sat together at family gatherings. And she would say things like, "You're old, mama. Maybe you shouldn't be handling this." I brushed it off at first, thinking I was just being sensitive, imagining hostility where there was none. But over time, it became impossible to ignore. Documents were pushed toward me without explanation. Decisions were made that excluded me. I could no longer access the accounts that had been in my name for decades. And my own home, my sanctuary, was suddenly being treated like it belonged to someone else. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A call not returned, a note left at the door, a decision made without my consent. But then the isolation began. Friends and relatives I had known for years seemed to vanish overnight. Visits that once brought joy and laughter were replaced with silence. I tried to speak, tried to assert my presence, and each time I did, I was met with excuses, avoidance, or thinly veiled pity. I began to feel as if I were fading into the background of my own life, as if the very family I had nurtured had decided I was no longer necessary. I still remember the day I discovered the legal documents filed against me. My son and his wife had petitioned the court, claiming I was mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. I could not believe it at first. How could my own child, my only son, stand in front of a judge and say that about me? The betrayal cut deep, far deeper than anything I had ever imagined. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment I had poured into raising him, supporting him, and even helping him and his wife get settled, it all felt suddenly invisible, reduced to nothing more than fodder for their scheme. As I sat in my favorite chair, holding the documents in my hands, I felt a mixture of anger, disbelief, and sorrow. My hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the realization that someone I had loved unconditionally could attempt to strip me of my dignity, my autonomy, and the life I'd worked so hard to build. And yet, I was not defeated. Years of experience of running my family's finances, managing property, and navigating life's complexities had taught me patience and strategy. I knew that the strength of a person was not measured by how loudly they could yell or how quickly they could intimidate, but by the quiet knowledge of what they possessed and how to use it wisely. Before we go any further, I want to pause for a moment. Please write in the comments where you're watching this from. And don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel can keep growing and bring you even more fascinating stories. After that, I realized that the court case was not just an attempt to take my property, it was an attempt to erase me, to rewrite the story of my life in a way that suited them. I spent hours reflecting, revisiting memories of my late husband, who had always been a steady hand guiding our family with wisdom and foresight. Even in his absence, the lessons he had imparted remained. Protect what is yours, trust in your own judgment, and never let fear dictate your actions. He had always said that age comes with insight, and that sometimes those who underestimate the elderly do so at their own peril. The days leading up to the court appearance were filled with careful preparation. I gathered every document, every property record, every account statement, and even evaluations from trusted professionals confirming my mental and emotional competence. I knew they thought they could catch me off guard, that they assumed I was vulnerable simply because I had aged. But I was ready. I was not just ready to defend myself. I was ready to reveal truths they could not imagine, truths that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. Evenings became my time to reflect and strategize. I walked slowly through the house, leaning on my cane, allowing myself to remember not just the betrayals, but the victories and achievements of my life. Every room carried memories of love, hard work, and resilience. The living room where my husband and I had celebrated anniversaries, the kitchen where I had taught my son to cook, the study where countless family decisions had been made, they were all mine. And I would defend them every inch, every corner, and every memory against those who would claim otherwise. I understood something essential in those moments of quiet reflection. The courtroom would be a stage, but the real battle was not just legal, it was personal. It was about respect, recognition, and the acknowledgement that I was not the fragile, forgetful woman they pretended I was. They would come expecting fear, expecting hesitation. They would not anticipate the resolve and clarity of someone who has spent a lifetime building and protecting a family legacy. And in that realization, I found a strange sense of calm, a clarity that steadied my heart even as my stomach churned with anticipation. The day of the hearing approached, and I began to rehearse not just what I would say, but the presence I would carry. I reminded myself that every gesture, every word, would communicate more than the legal arguments ever could. I would be dignified, unshaken, and assertive, not with anger, but with undeniable truth. I knew that in their eyes, I might appear to be merely an elderly woman walking with a cane, but in reality, I carried decades of knowledge, preparation, and unyielding strength. And that day, I would make them recognize it. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a chill that seemed to seep through the walls of my home and settle deep into my bones. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue suit that had belonged to my late husband. It was a subtle nod to the man who had built everything we had together, and it reminded me of the dignity I would carry into that room. I did not want to appear frail or vulnerable or frightened because they would have pounced on even the smallest hint of weakness. Every step I took toward the courthouse was deliberate, a quiet declaration that I was neither helpless nor afraid. Walking in, leaning lightly on my cane, I felt the familiar eyes on me, even before I reached the courtroom. Strangers, clerks, and lawyers glanced over, measuring me, assessing the situation. I kept my head high, and I made sure my posture communicated what my words would reinforce. I was in control. And then I saw them, my son, seated at the front of the courtroom with a smug smile, whispering something to his wife, who returned the gesture with a barely concealed smirk. My heart clenched, but not from fear. It was a pang of sorrow, of disappointment, of the realization that the child I had raised with love now found pride in seeing me diminished. As the proceedings began, the lawyer representing my son and daughter-in-law stood and outlined their case. They claimed, as I had feared, that I was mentally unfit to manage my affairs. They spoke in hushed, almost clinical tones about my age, about supposed lapses in memory, about moments that they twisted to appear as if they were evidence of incompetence. They assumed their words would shake me, that the courtroom would see me as feeble, and that my testimony would crumble under the weight of their assertions. But they underestimated the depth of preparation, the years of careful planning, and the clarity that comes from decades of life experience. I remained seated, listening intently, letting their words wash over me without reaction. There was no need for emotional outbursts yet. The truth was my weapon, and I had not even drawn it. I could feel the subtle shifts in the room as the judge listened, the slight frown that appeared as he considered the evidence. Still, I knew the final impact would come not from simply contesting their claims, but from revealing the layers of protection I had put in place long before this betrayal had even been imagined. When my turn came to speak, I stood slowly, adjusted my cane, and looked directly at my son and daughter-in-law. Their expressions wavered slightly, as if the confidence they had relied upon was beginning to crack. I began my statement calmly, deliberately, recounting not only the contributions I had made to our family, but also the careful planning and legal arrangements I had established to protect the family assets. Every property record, every trust fund, every professional evaluation was ready, organized meticulously over years of anticipation. I could see their panic grow subtly with every word. I reminded the court of the legacy my late husband had left behind, not in boastful terms, but as a matter of fact. The estates, the investments, the properties, all under my careful management and oversight. I revealed legal documents that confirmed my full mental capacity, and I explained the steps I had taken to ensure that nothing could be manipulated by those who sought to take advantage of me in my elder years. The courtroom was silent as the reality of my preparedness sank in, and I watched as my son's confident posture faltered. He had assumed that my age equated to weakness, and now he was confronted with evidence that defied every assumption he had made. The courtroom staff, the judge, and even my son's lawyer had no choice but to acknowledge the thoroughness of my preparation. I saw the tension in their faces, the subtle hand movements, the way the daughter-in-law's smile disappeared, replaced with a nervous tightening of her lips. They had counted on underestimating me, and now that miscalculation was becoming painfully obvious, I felt a sense of satisfaction, tempered by sadness, knowing that the people I had once loved and trusted had resorted to deceit and manipulation to try to wrest control away from me. I paused then, allowing the weight of my words to settle, and then I revealed the final piece of my strategy, a detailed account of the late husband's legacy, the names, histories, and connections that carried weight in financial and legal circles. The judge leaned forward, squinting at the documents, and I could see a subtle tremble in his hand as he whispered under his breath, though loud enough for me to hear, "My God, is that really him?" The room went silent, and I realized that every assumption about my weakness, every underestimation of my capabilities, was now unraveling. As the evidence continued to unfold, I noticed my son's laughter from the beginning of the hearing had completely vanished. His smugness was replaced by panic and disbelief. My daughter-in-law, once poised and cold, now struggled to maintain composure, her hands wringing nervously as she realized the magnitude of their miscalculation. I remained calm, steady, and unwavering. The years of betrayal had been difficult, but I had prepared for this moment, and nothing would shake the truth that was now laid bare before the court. When the judge finally spoke, his tone was measured, yet carried a weight of realization that neither my son nor his wife could dismiss. He acknowledged the thoroughness of the documentation, the credibility of the evaluations, and the clear evidence that I was fully capable of managing my affairs. The case, once filled with confident claims of my incompetence, began to collapse under the sheer weight of truth and preparation. I could feel a quiet triumph building inside me, but I did not gloat. This was not about vengeance. It was about justice and recognition. After hours of presentation, questions, and careful examination, the courtroom reached a turning point. The truth of my life's work, the careful stewardship of my late husband's legacy, and the evidence of my mental and emotional capacity could not be disputed. The weight of decades of planning, experience, and careful protection of assets was finally acknowledged, and I felt a profound sense of vindication. The people who had tried to deceive me, who had thought themselves clever and confident, now faced the consequences of their choices. Leaving the courtroom that day, I felt a mixture of relief, sorrow, and empowerment. Relief that justice had been served, sorrow for the betrayal of my son and the emotional pain it had caused, and empowerment from the realization that age, experience, and careful planning can protect even the most vulnerable. I knew that the path ahead would involve rebuilding trust, assessing relationships, and guarding the legacy I had fought so hard to preserve. But in that moment, I walked out with dignity intact, my strength recognized, and the knowledge that those who underestimate the quiet power of an elder often do so at their own peril. After leaving the courtroom, the weight of everything that had happened began to settle more fully on my shoulders. Walking down the courthouse steps, cane in hand, I felt a strange 1009 of exhaustion and adrenaline. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of early spring blooms, but I hardly noticed it. My mind was replaying the courtroom scene in meticulous detail. The judge's widened eyes, the stunned silence, my son's expression twisting from smugness to disbelief, and the subtle trembling of my daughter-in-law's hands. For years, I had feared the day they would try to take what was mine, and now that fear had materialized and been laid to rest. But while I had won in court, I couldn't ignore the emotional toll. My son didn't follow me outside. I hadn't expected him to. He was still seated inside, perhaps trying to reconcile the person I had always been, the nurturing, devoted mother, with the force of will I displayed as I defended my autonomy. I remembered moments from my son's childhood when he had clung to me, seeking comfort and guidance. And it pained me deeply to realize that the little boy who once relied on me had grown into a man who would question my abilities and even seek to diminish me. Life has a cruel way of teaching lessons, sometimes too late. As I reached my car, I allowed myself a small, private smile. The documents I had prepared, the careful attention I had paid to every detail of the property and finances, had been more than enough to dismantle their scheme. It was validation not just of my mental acuity, but of my foresight. Decades of life experience, hard work, and strategic thinking had culminated in this moment, and no amount of condescension or manipulation could change that. Yet, the thought that my own son and daughter-in-law had underestimated me, had assumed I was weak and incapable, stirred a mix of sorrow and righteous anger. Driving home, I allowed my mind to wander to the events that had led to this confrontation. It hadn't happened overnight. My son's gradual change had been almost imperceptible at first. A sharp tone here, a dismissive remark there. But it had grown over time, accelerated by the influence of his wife. I could see now how carefully they had orchestrated their plan, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every small comment, every slight, every subtle exclusion from decision-making had been part of their preparation. They had counted on my vulnerability after my husband's death, on the assumption that age equated to frailty. And yet, here I was, intact, vindicated, and stronger than ever. The house felt different when I returned, as if it had been waiting for me to reclaim it fully. I walked through familiar rooms, letting my gaze linger on the pictures of my late husband, of family gatherings, and of my son as a child. I allowed myself to touch the edges of the frames, remembering the hands that had held mine, the laughter that had filled the rooms, the love that had been my constant companion. These memories were a source of both comfort and grief. Comfort, because they reminded me of a life well lived and a family I had nurtured. Grief, because the betrayal of those I trusted most was now undeniable. I spent that evening reviewing my legal files once again, double-checking that everything was secure, that every trust, property deed, and financial account was in order. There was no room for error, no possibility of oversight. I realized that part of my preparation was not just legal, it was emotional. I had built a resilience that no courtroom, no son, and no daughter-in-law could break. They had sought to intimidate me, to isolate me, and to make me feel small. Instead, I had demonstrated the power of a mind sharpened by experience and a heart fortified by decades of responsibility and love. Yet, even with this victory, the emotional wounds were deep. I could not ignore the sting of my son's laughter at the beginning of the hearing, nor the cold calculations of my daughter-in-law. These were not just legal battles. They were battles of the heart, tests of loyalty and respect. And in many ways, the emotional scars would take longer to heal than the legal ones. I understood now that winning in court was only part of the battle. Reclaiming the trust in the relationship, or at least finding peace with their betrayal, would be a much longer journey. That night, I reflected on the lessons I had learned. Life is unpredictable, and even those we hold closest can become agents of pain and disappointment. Yet, the quiet strength cultivated through years of experience, patience, and careful planning is a formidable shield. I thought about the importance of foresight, not just in legal matters, but in all aspects of life. Preparation is not merely a precaution. It is an act of self-respect, a declaration that one's autonomy and dignity are not to be taken lightly. The following morning, I began to rebuild my daily routines with renewed purpose. I paid attention to details that I had sometimes overlooked, focusing on the management of my properties and finances with an intensity fueled by both relief and determination. I reached out to trusted friends and advisors, reaffirming relationships that had stood the test of time and gently distancing myself from those who had shown their true colors. It was a delicate balance, asserting authority without closing myself off to the warmth of human connection. In the days that followed, I began to notice subtle changes in my son's demeanor when he visited, or when our paths crossed. His smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by hesitation and guilt. The daughter-in-law, once so poised and commanding, now moved with a careful, measured step, acutely aware that her arrogance had been misplaced. While I did not seek to humiliate them, there was satisfaction in seeing that the respect I had always deserved was now undeniable. Actions have consequences, and the court's acknowledgement of the truth had made that perfectly clear. I also took time for myself, indulging in quiet reflection, enjoying long walks in the garden, and revisiting letters and keepsakes from my husband. These moments of introspection were not simply nostalgia. They were reaffirmations of the life I had built, the values I had upheld, and the resilience that had carried me through trials I had never imagined facing. I realized that true strength is not just about defending what is ours. It is about maintaining one's integrity, wisdom, and dignity even when others attempt to undermine them. Through it all, I discovered a renewed sense of purpose. While the betrayal had been painful, it had also highlighted the importance of self reliance and preparedness. I had survived a challenge that tested both my mind and my heart, and I emerged not only intact, but empowered. I vowed to continue safeguarding my legacy, nurturing the relationships that mattered, and holding fast to the lessons life had so painstakingly taught me. The days following the courtroom victory were both liberating and unsettling. It was as if a weight had been lifted, yet I felt the echo of betrayal lingering in the corners of my mind. My home, once a place of comfort, now seemed like a stage where past wounds replayed themselves silently. Every familiar chair, every photograph on the wall, reminded me of the trust I had placed in my family, a trust that had been broken. And yet, I refused to let the bitterness take root. I was not a woman defined by the treachery of others, but by the resilience I had built over decades. I spent the mornings reviewing my estate plans, ensuring every detail was airtight. The legal victories had given me freedom, but I knew better than to rely solely on the court's judgment. My husband's estate, the properties I managed, the investments we had carefully curated, all of it needed constant attention. I made notes, cross checked accounts, and called my financial advisors regularly. Every action reinforced the reality that I was still in control, that my autonomy could never again be questioned. Preparation had been my salvation, and vigilance would be my shield moving forward. Even with all this, I could not ignore the lingering pain when I thought of my son. I remembered the way he had laughed in the courtroom, a sound that had once brought me joy when he was a boy, now twisted into mockery and arrogance. It was this same son who had clung to my hand as a toddler, who had looked to me for guidance, for love. And yet, in the years following my husband's death, he had allowed someone else's influence to overshadow the bond we had shared. I could feel my chest tighten just thinking about it, but I reminded myself that his actions did not define my worth or my accomplishments. The daughter in law was another story entirely. Her calculated politeness had always made my skin crawl, but now I could see it for what it truly was: fear. She had believed she could manipulate and intimidate me, yet here she was, cornered by her own misjudgment. I didn't rejoice in her discomfort, but I acknowledged it silently, as a recognition that justice had a way of balancing itself, even in the smallest details. Her smirk had vanished, replaced by cautious glances and stiff manners whenever our paths crossed. It was a small vindication, a subtle reminder that the truth, when wielded wisely, cannot be ignored. I also began to notice a change in my own daily routine. I had always been active, engaged, and meticulous, but now I approached life with renewed purpose. I revisited old hobbies I had neglected, tended to my garden with care, and even took time to reconnect with long-lost friends. The courtroom battle had demanded so much energy, and it had reminded me that life is fleeting. I wanted to fill my days with things that mattered, not just for survival, but for joy and fulfillment. It was a form of reclamation, a way to assert that my life was mine to shape, regardless of the shadows cast by betrayal. There were moments, however, when grief still crept in. I missed my husband terribly. His absence had left a void that no legal victory could fill. I missed his laughter, his guidance, the way he had steadied me in times of doubt. In quiet moments, I would sit by the window, hands clasped, remembering our life together and feeling the sting of loneliness. But these were also the moments that strengthened me. They reminded me that love, even when lost, shapes the core of who we are. My grief, tempered by resilience, became a source of quiet strength rather than despair. The media coverage of the case, though limited, also brought an unexpected awareness. A few community members, neighbors, and distant relatives reached out, expressing support and admiration. Some offered condolences for the betrayal I had endured. Others shared stories of similar experiences. I realized then that my story, painful as it was, might serve as a lesson or inspiration for others. That recognition was empowering. It reminded me that while personal betrayal can isolate you, the human experience connects us in unexpected ways. Sharing our struggles, even in subtle ways, can illuminate paths for others who feel similarly alone. As the days turned into weeks, I began planning for the future with an almost meticulous optimism. I wanted to protect my legacy, yes, but I also wanted to rebuild relationships that were healthy and meaningful. I reached out to a few trusted family members who would remain supportive through the ordeal. Their presence reminded me that not all bonds are fragile, and that love and loyalty could still be found. In their company, I rediscovered the joy of connection without fear or pretense. These were small victories, quieter than the courtroom battle, but no less significant. Despite the relief of legal and emotional reclamation, I could not ignore the undercurrent of tension whenever my son appeared. He avoided me, his eyes flicking nervously toward me when he thought I wasn't noticing. I could sense his lingering guilt, his awareness that he had misjudged me. And while I didn't relish the opportunity to see him humbled, I acknowledged it as a natural consequence of his actions. In time, perhaps he would seek understanding or reconciliation. But for now, I prioritized my own peace, refusing to be drawn into his manipulations or apologies. At night, as I sat in my favorite armchair, I reflected on the lessons of this experience. Life does not always grant us fair treatment, nor does it guarantee that those we love will honor our trust. Yet, wisdom, vigilance, and preparation are powerful tools against injustice. I realize that true empowerment comes not from defeating others, but from cultivating one's own strength, foresight, and dignity. And so, as I closed my eyes each night, I did so with the assurance that I had survived, learned, and emerged stronger than ever before. Life after the courtroom verdict wasn't as simple as I had imagined. There was relief, yes, and a profound sense of validation, but it didn't magically erase the scars left behind. Each day was a delicate balance between vigilance and letting myself live freely again. I was no longer bound by the fear of losing my property or being silenced, yet old habits die hard. I found myself double checking every document, every signature, every detail that could potentially be exploited. Experience had taught me that trust must be earned, not assumed, and that one's own strength is often the best protection. My son, once so quick to dismiss me, now avoided direct confrontation. His laughter in the courtroom, which had cut me deeper than any knife, was replaced by a tense silence whenever our eyes met. I could see the shame in his posture, the hesitance in his voice when he did speak, and it both saddened and reassured me. Sad because he had chosen a path of betrayal, reassured because the balance of power had shifted back to where it belonged. I had survived their plot, and he now understood that underestimating me was a grave mistake. It didn't erase the hurt, but it made it less sharp, more like a distant echo than an immediate wound. The daughter-in-law was another story entirely. She had once wielded her influence like a weapon, using words and subtle gestures to make me doubt my own judgment. But her confidence had crumbled. Every interaction now carried a cautious politeness, a thin veil that barely concealed her fear of further exposure. I didn't indulge in gloating. There was no joy in seeing someone reduced by their own actions. But I acknowledged internally that the tables had turned. The arrogance that had once filled the room when she was near had been replaced with careful, measured movements. It was a silent recognition that deceit and cruelty eventually meet their match. In the quiet mornings, I began to reclaim small pleasures I had abandoned over the years. I would sit by the window with my tea, watching the sunrise, savoring the simple act of being alive. I took walks in the neighborhood, greeting neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years, and rediscovered the sense of community I had lost amidst family turmoil. Each day was a gentle reminder that life continues beyond betrayal, that joy can be found even after pain, and that resilience is a habit cultivated over time. The world, in all its ordinary beauty, was mine to experience again. Financially, I was more secure than ever, but I remained cautious. I met regularly with advisors, reviewed statements, and ensured that all legal protections were in place. My late husband's estate had been carefully structured, and now I understood just how much foresight he had put into ensuring my independence. Every decision I made reinforced that I was not just a survivor of deceit, but a guardian of my own legacy. And this time, I would be unyielding in protecting it. The experience had taught me that vigilance isn't paranoia, it's wisdom. Yet, there were moments when emotion got the better of me. I remembered the faces of my grandchildren, their innocent trust in the adults around them, and it pained me to think that their environment had been clouded by manipulation. I had raised my son with love and guidance, and it hurt to see him influenced by someone who did not share the same values. It was a sobering reminder that life's lessons are not always received as we hope, and that disappointment often comes from the very people we love the most. But anger, I reminded myself, must be tempered with perspective. Holding on to resentment would only steal from my peace. To reclaim more than just my finances, I began reconnecting with friends and family who had distanced themselves during the legal battle. It was a cautious process. Trust, once fractured, takes time to rebuild. But in these connections, I found warmth, encouragement, and a sense of belonging that reminded me that I was not alone. These relationships were a lifeline, a reminder that even amidst betrayal, there are people who honor integrity and care for your well being. Slowly, these bonds began to fill the spaces left by disappointment, replacing isolation with genuine human connection. I also reflected on my own strength, realizing that resilience is as much a mindset as it is a series of actions. I had faced emotional manipulation, financial threats, and the heartbreak of familial betrayal, and yet, I had emerged not just intact, but empowered. This perspective allowed me to navigate interactions with my son and daughter in law without fear or defensiveness. I no longer reacted from a place of hurt. I acted from a place of measured wisdom, knowing that control over my own life was mine to maintain. This inner fortitude was perhaps my greatest victory. As I walked through my home, touching the furniture, the walls, the spaces I had once feared losing, I felt a profound sense of ownership, not just over property, but over my own life. I had survived manipulation and deceit, and in doing so, I had reclaimed a narrative that was mine alone. My son and daughter in law had assumed they could diminish me, but they underestimated decades of experience, foresight, and quiet strength. In this reclamation, I found not just satisfaction, but a renewed commitment to living authentically, fully, and without apology. The future, though uncertain, no longer intimidated me. I had the tools, the knowledge, and the inner resilience to face whatever came next. I had survived a test that could have broken me, and in doing so, I had discovered that true power lies not in control over others, but in mastery over oneself. Each day was an opportunity to reinforce that understanding, to live with dignity, and to honor the legacy my husband and I had built together. And as I looked toward the horizon, I felt a quiet confidence that no betrayal could ever diminish again. Even after the courtroom drama had ended, the house felt different. The echoes of the past months, confrontations, whispers, threats, still lingered in the hallways, and I found myself pausing before entering rooms I had once walked through freely. My son and daughter in law still lived under the same roof at times, visiting or attending family gatherings, but the dynamic had shifted completely. I could sense their tension, the careful measures they took to avoid triggering any further exposure of their deceit. It was a quiet battlefield now, and I had the advantage. Yet, I realized that victory over deception doesn't erase emotional damage, and some wounds take far longer to heal. I started noticing the subtleties of their changed behavior. My son, once arrogant and dismissive, now spoke in careful, measured tones when I was around. Even casual questions from him were weighed, as if he were rehearsing his words before they left his mouth. The laughter that had mocked me in the courtroom was gone, replaced with a hesitant uncertainty. I couldn't ignore the sting of past betrayal, but I also recognized that fear had a way of shaping behavior. His avoidance wasn't reconciliation. It was the awareness of the power I now held, a power that came from knowledge, preparation, and unshakable self-respect. His wife, the daughter-in-law, was even more delicate in her approach. She had once wielded false concern as a weapon, using polite smiles to cover her contempt. Now, those smiles were strained, thinly masking panic. Every interaction was measured, every word chosen carefully, as if she feared the slightest misstep could expose her past duplicity. I observed her closely, not with malice, but with a quiet satisfaction. Her confidence had been dismantled, not by force or cruelty, but by truth and preparedness. It was a subtle reminder that authenticity carries weight, and deceit, no matter how cunning, eventually falters. Despite the caution in my household, I sought to rebuild normalcy where I could. I invited neighbors for tea, attended community events, and even reconnected with old friends I had lost touch with over the years. These moments reminded me that life outside the walls of manipulation and deceit was vibrant and full of possibility. It was a gentle reclaiming of joy, and I cherished it deeply. Each conversation, each shared laugh, reinforced that the world still held kindness and connection, and that I was not defined by the betrayal I had endured. Financial and legal security had given me peace of mind, but I realized emotional recovery required something more. I began writing again, documenting my thoughts and experiences in journals that I had long neglected. It was a personal therapy, a way to process the months of manipulation and fear. Writing allowed me to separate the emotional chaos from my sense of self, to examine the events with clarity and perspective. Through it, I discovered a deeper understanding of my own resilience and a newfound appreciation for the quiet strength I had cultivated over decades. One afternoon, while reviewing old family photographs, I reflected on my journey. Images of my late husband, my son as a child, and moments of family celebration reminded me of what had motivated me throughout my life: love, care, and protection. I had dedicated myself to ensuring my family thrived, yet I had learned that dedication alone cannot prevent betrayal. True protection requires foresight, vigilance, and the courage to assert one's own boundaries. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of completion, not over revenge, but over understanding. I knew I had acted with integrity, and that knowledge brought a peace no courtroom victory could replicate. Despite the calm I had regained, moments of confrontation still arose. My son occasionally tested boundaries, asking questions about family decisions, inheritance, or financial matters. Each time, I responded with measured calm, never allowing anger or resentment to dictate my words. It was a delicate dance, balancing authority with patience. I could see the realization slowly settling in that his previous attempts to control or belittle me would no longer work. My voice, once dismissed, now carried the weight of experience, preparation, and the quiet assertion of someone who had endured and emerged stronger. I also reflected on the lessons this experience had taught me beyond family. Life is unpredictable, and those we trust the most can sometimes surprise us in the most painful ways. Yet, it is in these moments of challenge that strength is forged. I realize that vulnerability is not weakness, it is simply a part of being human. What matters is how one responds to betrayal, manipulation, or deception. I had chosen preparation, foresight, and measured action, and those choices had preserved not just my assets, but my dignity and autonomy. It was a lesson I hoped to carry forward, and perhaps one I could pass on to others who might face similar trials. Even as my household settled into this new equilibrium, I found myself thinking about legacy, what we leave behind, not just in material wealth, but in lessons and example. My late husband had structured our affairs carefully, ensuring my independence and protection. I had acted wisely to honor that legacy. Now, I wanted to consider how I could protect and guide the next generation, not just from financial pitfalls, but from the emotional manipulation that I had endured. It became clear that vigilance, education, and the cultivation of integrity were the most important gifts I could provide. And so, life continued, a careful balance between caution and liberation. I moved through my days with a renewed sense of purpose, aware that the past could not be erased, but also certain that it no longer had the power to control me. My son and daughter in law had learned their lessons, and I had reclaimed mine. Each interaction, each decision, each quiet reflection was a reaffirmation of who I was and what I stood for. I had survived betrayal, and in doing so, I had discovered the unassailable strength that comes from wisdom, preparation, and an unwavering belief in oneself. The days that followed were quieter, but the tension in the house never fully disappeared. I had won the legal battle, regained control over my property and finances, and restored my autonomy. But rebuilding trust, or even normalcy, with my son was another matter entirely. I could feel the distance between us, the invisible walls his arrogance and his wife's manipulations had built over years. Yet, I refused to let bitterness dictate my actions. I understood that change comes slowly, and forcing reconciliation rarely works. Instead, I chose to lead by example, showing patience, composure, and strength in every interaction. I noticed small shifts in my son's behavior over the following weeks. At first, they were almost imperceptible. A polite nod here, a question asked with genuine curiosity there, rather than curt dismissal. It was as if he was testing the waters, seeing whether the old patterns of disrespect would still succeed. I met each cautious gesture with measured warmth, careful not to reward past bad behavior, but also not to punish him unnecessarily. It was a delicate balance, asserting authority while opening a door for potential understanding. I wanted him to see that respect isn't demanded through fear or intimidation, but earned through integrity and self awareness. His wife, on the other hand, remained a more complex presence. I could sense her struggle, the tension between her old arrogance and her new awareness that the dynamics had shifted. In moments when she tried to assert control or make subtle digs, I responded with calm clarity, never raised my voice, but always made my position unmistakable. It was exhausting at times, but it was necessary. I realized that my greatest strength in this period wasn't just legal authority, it was emotional composure. By refusing to react impulsively to provocation, I maintained control over the narrative and demonstrated the depth of my resilience. One afternoon, while reviewing some documents related to our family property, my son quietly entered the study. I looked up from my papers and caught him glancing at a stack of old photographs on my desk. He lingered there longer than expected, as if trying to connect with a past he had long dismissed. I didn't speak immediately, letting him choose his words carefully. Finally, he said, "Mom, I didn't realize how much work you did to keep everything in order after Dad passed." It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, a small step toward recognition. I nodded gently, meeting his gaze, and replied, "It's been my responsibility, yes. And I hope one day you understand why it was necessary." These small exchanges gradually became more frequent. He began asking questions about family history, about how certain decisions were made, and even about my late husband's legacy. I answered patiently, using the opportunity to educate him not just about finances or property, but about integrity, resilience, and foresight. It was a subtle reclamation of influence, not through force, but through knowledge and the example of someone who had endured and emerged stronger. Slowly, the tension began to ease, replaced by cautious curiosity on his part and measured openness on mine. Despite these developments, I remained vigilant. I knew that old habits and resentments could resurface if boundaries were not maintained. Each interaction required careful navigation, particularly when his wife was present. She still carried traces of her old arrogance, but now it was tempered by the awareness of my legal and emotional authority. I didn't need to confront her directly. The shift in the household was evident in her cautious movements and careful words. Even simple conversations carried an undercurrent of respect, the acknowledgement that she could no longer manipulate or undermine me without consequences. During this period, I also took time to reconnect with myself. I returned to hobbies and passions that had been set aside during the years of caregiving and family obligations. Gardening became a daily ritual, a source of peace and grounding. Writing continued to serve as emotional therapy, helping me process the lingering hurt while documenting the wisdom I had gained. These personal pursuits reminded me that life continues beyond the confines of betrayal and family conflict, and that true strength comes from nurturing both the mind and spirit. As the months passed, I began to see my son in a new light. The arrogance and impatience had not vanished entirely, but there was a softness emerging, a recognition of my wisdom and experience, and perhaps even regret for his past behavior. Our conversations grew longer, more thoughtful, and occasionally tinged with humor. I sensed that he was beginning to understand the depth of the lessons I had tried to teach him, not through lectures, but through living example. I didn't rush this transformation, understanding that genuine change comes from self-realization rather than coercion. The most profound moment came unexpectedly. One evening, he approached me while I was organizing old family photographs. He hesitated, then said, "Mom, I've been thinking. I don't know if I said it properly before, but I'm sorry for the way I treated you these past years." His voice was tentative, almost fragile, but the words carried weight. I felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and hope. Relief that acknowledgement had finally come, sadness for the years lost to mistrust, and hope that this was a beginning rather than an isolated moment. I reached out and held his hand gently, responding, "Thank you." That means a lot. Now we can work on moving forward carefully, but together. This marked a turning point in our relationship. I knew that reconciliation would not erase the past, but it provided a foundation for building a more honest and respectful connection. My son's actions and words began reflecting a desire to understand rather than dominate, and I reciprocated with patience and guidance. It was not a perfect restoration. Some scars remained, and the daughter in law's presence still demanded vigilance. But it was progress, the kind that comes from enduring hardship and choosing strength over bitterness. In these moments, I realized that the greatest victory was not the courtroom triumph or the reclamation of property. It was the restoration of dignity, the affirmation of wisdom, and the quiet reassertion of authority over one's own life. I had faced betrayal at the hands of my own child, yet I had emerged resilient, composed, and empowered. That resilience became the guiding principle for every interaction, every decision, and every step toward rebuilding trust and connection. Even now, as I reflect on this period of my life, I understand that true strength lies in balance, asserting authority when necessary, but also embracing compassion and patience. My son and I continue to navigate our relationship carefully, aware of past mistakes, but committed to a future built on honesty and mutual respect. And while the pain of betrayal may never fully vanish, it no longer defines me. I am no longer a victim of deceit or manipulation. I am a woman who has endured, learned, and reclaimed her life on her own terms. The following months were both a relief and a test. I had won the legal battle, regained my autonomy, and even witnessed subtle changes in my son's demeanor. But life after betrayal demanded constant vigilance. The courtroom drama had ended, but the personal work, the emotional reconciliation, and the rebuilding of boundaries was far from over. I realized that I couldn't just rest on the laurels of victory. I had to continue demonstrating strength, wisdom, and patience in every interaction. This was not only for my own well being, but for the legacy I hoped to leave behind, one of dignity, resilience, and self respect. I began to take steps to redefine the household dynamic. My son, still learning humility, had moments of genuine curiosity, asking questions about family history or the management of property. I answered with precision and patience, careful not to lecture, but always ensuring he understood the depth of responsibility I'd carried all those years. The daughter in law remained a challenge. Her previous arrogance had been tempered, but her attempts at subtle manipulation still surfaced now and then. I responded with calm firmness, never raising my voice, but making it clear that the old tactics no longer worked. My presence alone became a reminder that I was not to be underestimated. One afternoon, while reviewing financial statements in my study, my son entered quietly, almost hesitantly. He picked up a framed photograph of my late husband and studied it with a thoughtful expression. I watched him carefully, sensing that this was not a casual gesture. Mom, he began softly, I've been thinking about everything. How much you've sacrificed, how much you've protected. I don't think I ever truly appreciated it before. His voice was unsteady, but the words carried weight. I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. It's never too late to recognize what matters, I said, choosing my tone deliberately, calm but warm. Understanding takes time, and I hope you'll continue to learn. These moments of tentative acknowledgement grew over weeks. My son started consulting me on decisions rather than bypassing me entirely. He began to ask for advice about managing family property, seeking insights on matters I had long handled alone. It was a subtle shift, but a meaningful one. I could see the emergence of respect, slowly replacing arrogance. It wasn't an immediate transformation, but it was progress, the kind that comes from consistent, patient leadership rather than harsh confrontation. The daughter in law, sensing that the balance of power had shifted, adjusted her behavior as well. Her cold politeness remained, but now it was underscored by an awareness of my authority. Attempts to undermine or belittle me met with polite but unyielding resistance. I didn't need to speak harshly. The courtroom had already cemented my position, and I could feel her recalibrating with every interaction. The subtle tension that lingered in our home was no longer oppressive. It was a reminder of the lessons they had both learned the hard way. I also continued to nurture my own life outside of family conflict. My mornings were spent tending to my garden, afternoons with writing or community engagement, and evenings with quiet reflection. These routines restored a sense of peace and reinforced the knowledge that my life was more than the drama of betrayal and reconciliation. I found joy in small achievements, whether a thriving flower bed or a well written reflection on resilience. Each act was a reaffirmation of my identity, separate from the turmoil my son and daughter in law had caused. Despite the progress, occasional reminders of the past lingered. My son would sometimes hesitate in decision making, as if unsure whether to assert authority or defer to me. I allowed him to navigate these moments, giving guidance when necessary but never controlling. I understood that part of rebuilding trust and respect required letting him experience responsibility for his actions, while always knowing that I was a steady, supportive presence. This balance reinforced the lessons he had once ignored, that respect is earned, not demanded, and that true leadership blends strength with wisdom. The defining moment came one evening when my son approached me with an old family ledger he had discovered while cleaning the study. "Mom, I found this," he said quietly. "I had no idea how carefully, Dad, and you managed everything. I, I feel like I've been blind to it all." His voice carried humility, tinged with regret. I examined the ledger alongside him, explaining each entry, the decisions behind investments, and the foresight that had guided our family's legacy. He listened intently, genuinely engaged, and I realized that the lessons I had tried to impart for years were finally sinking in. For the first time, I sensed a shift that went beyond surface level acknowledgement. My son's respect was no longer cautious, it was earned. He began participating actively in decisions, consulting me, and seeking my counsel with genuine consideration. The daughter in law, observing these changes, adjusted her behavior accordingly. The household atmosphere slowly transformed from tension and subtle hostility to one of cautious harmony. The power dynamic was balanced, no longer defined by manipulation or disregard, but by mutual recognition of experience, wisdom, and accountability. I often reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. From betrayal and legal battles to cautious reconciliation and regained authority, the path had been challenging, exhausting, and at times painful. Yet through patience, resilience, and an unwavering belief in my own capacity, I had not only reclaimed control over property and finances, but had also restored dignity to my role as mother, matriarch, and individual. I had learned that true power is not about domination or fear. It is about composure, knowledge, and the ability to guide others toward respect through example. Even now, as I continue to navigate my relationships with my son and daughter in law, I understand that the lessons extend beyond family dynamics. They are reminders that age does not diminish wisdom, that patience can outlast arrogance, and that resilience is the quiet force that shapes outcomes. I have emerged stronger, not by holding onto bitterness, but by embracing clarity, foresight, and unwavering integrity. The laughter that once mocked me in the courtroom has been replaced by understanding and cautious respect, a testament to the strength of enduring through betrayal and reclaiming one's life. As I close this chapter of my life, I feel a sense of calm accomplishment. I have navigated treachery, reclaimed what was rightfully mine, and begun to mend the fractured bonds with those who once underestimated me. It is a slow process, but each day brings a deeper sense of balance, recognition, and, most importantly, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I faced adversity with strength, dignity, and wisdom that cannot be taken away. The months following the courtroom victory felt like a second life, one where I could finally breathe without the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. I had my property, my finances, and most importantly, my dignity intact. But the real work wasn't just reclaiming what was mine. It was reclaiming peace within myself and deciding how to move forward with the son I once adored, yet who had once betrayed me so deeply. I realized that forgiveness wasn't about letting them off the hook. It was about freeing myself from the constant anger and hurt that had threatened to consume me. My son and daughter in law had made choices that hurt me profoundly, and their actions could never be erased. But I could choose how to respond to them now, with a clarity and strength that had been forged through years of resilience. I began to treat interactions with them deliberately, assertive yet calm, firm but not hostile. I set boundaries that were respected because I had proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I would not be manipulated or silenced. One morning, my son approached me as I was tending the garden. There was no hesitancy in his voice this time, only a quiet sincerity I hadn't seen before. Mom, I've been thinking about what happened, he said. I see now how much you sacrificed, how much you protected, everything. I don't know if I can make up for it, but I want to try. My heart clenched with a mixture of relief and lingering sadness. I had longed for this acknowledgement, but I knew it would take time to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. I nodded, offering a small, measured smile. Acknowledgement is a start, I said gently. Actions over time will show your commitment. That's how trust is rebuilt. The daughter in law, meanwhile, had grown quieter, more aware of her position in the household and the respect she now owed me. I could see the tension that once defined our interactions easing, replaced by a cautious civility. It wasn't friendship, and it wasn't immediate harmony, but it was workable. And for me, that was enough. The days of fearing manipulation and covert attacks were over, replaced with a clear understanding of boundaries and consequences. I also began to invest more in myself, finally carving out time for the things I had neglected while managing family, grief, and betrayal. I joined a local writing group, attended community events, and spent quiet afternoons revisiting old hobbies that had brought me joy. It was liberating to reclaim not just my property or my finances, but my sense of identity, who I was outside the drama, outside the family conflicts. These small moments became anchors, grounding me in the knowledge that my life was still mine to shape, regardless of past wounds. Looking back, I could see how the entire ordeal had changed me. I was stronger, sharper, and more aware of my worth. I understood the fragility of trust and the depth of human ambition, but I also knew the enduring power of patience, integrity, and resilience. The laughter in the courtroom, once a symbol of humiliation, had become a distant memory, a testament to the arrogance of those who underestimate the quiet strength of an elder. And now, in its place, there was calm authority, earned respect, and the satisfaction of having weathered betrayal without losing myself. One evening, as I sat on the veranda overlooking the garden, my son came to join me. We didn't speak immediately. We simply watched the sun dip below the horizon, the sky painted in soft hues of orange and pink. There was a new rhythm to our interactions, a balance between respect and lingering wariness. He reached out, hesitated, and then gently took my hand. It was a small gesture, but one that carried immense significance. I squeezed his hand in return, acknowledging the tentative bridge that had begun to form between us. It wouldn't erase the past, but it was a start, a fragile, beautiful start. In those quiet moments, I reflected on the lessons this journey had imparted. Age does not diminish wisdom. Experience does not fade with years. And betrayal, though painful, can reveal strength we didn't know we possessed. I had endured deceit, humiliation, and emotional manipulation, and yet I emerged not broken but fortified. I had reclaimed my life, my family legacy, and my self-respect, proving that even when those closest to us falter, our inner fortitude can prevail. The story of my courtroom triumph and personal reclamation wasn't just about property or legal victories. It was about dignity, resilience, and the quiet power that comes from knowing your worth. I had faced the betrayal of my own child, weathered the schemes of manipulation, and stood firm in the face of condescension and doubt. And in doing so, I discovered something far greater than victory in court. I discovered the enduring strength of a woman who refused to be silenced, underestimated, or diminished by age or circumstance. As I closed the chapter on this tumultuous time, I felt a profound sense of closure. My family's dynamics had shifted, my autonomy was secured, and my life had returned to a rhythm defined by clarity and purpose. The emotional wounds would linger, yes, but they had been transformed into a source of wisdom. I had learned that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. Trust, once broken, can be cautiously rebuilt. And above all, the quiet strength of an elder is a force not to be underestimated. And so, with the weight of past betrayals lifted and the promise of cautious, respectful relationships ahead, I moved forward with confidence. The laughter that had once mocked me in the courtroom was gone. In its place was quiet dignity, hard-won respect, and the unshakable knowledge that I had not only survived, but thrived, emerging stronger, wiser, and ever determined to live life on my own terms.